Throughout history, many great figures have left a profound impact on human civilization. From brilliant leaders and exceptional scientists to visionary thinkers, they have helped shape the world as we know it today. The man known to history as Peter the Great, Tsar of all Russia, was born on the 9th of June, 1672, in the city of Moscow, although one will find his date of birth described as being slightly different, depending on whether the Greek Orthodox, Julian, or Gregorian calendar date is being used. Peter's father was Alexis I, Tsar of all Russia. He had succeeded to that position back in 1645, when he was just 16 years of age. His mother was Natalia Narishkina, Alexis's second wife. He was the first child of Natalia and Alexis's marriage, they having married just a year before Peter was born. They would have two daughters in the years that followed, Natalia and Fyodora. However, Alexis already had numerous children from his first marriage to Maria Ilyinichna Milolovskaya. Their union had produced 5 sons and 8 daughters between 1648 and 1669. On first impression, this would seem to have drastically reduced the possibility of young Peter ever succeeding his father, but of his 5 half-brothers, 3 had already died before Peter was ever born. Dmitri died in infancy in 1649. Another, named Simeon, died in 1669 when he was 4 years of age, and the crown prince, Alexei, died early in 1670 at 15 years of age. Therefore, there was a realistic possibility that Peter might rise to become Tsar of all Russia one day, though he still had 2 elder half-brothers ahead of him in the succession. Theodore, born in 1661, and Ivan, born in 1666. Peter's early life was one of court ritual and an elite education in line with his status as a son of the Tsar. His household was ensconced in the amusement palace near the western wall of the Kremlin in central Moscow. Here, he had some Russian tutors, amongst whom Nikita Zotov was prominent, a former tax official and clerk who taught Peter many of the basics of Russian grammar and literature. It is often claimed that Peter was also taught to some extent by both Paul Menesios and Patrick Gordon, 2 Scottish soldiers employed by Peter's father at a time when Scottish mercenary commanders had been heavily involved in the wars of Northern and Eastern Europe for half a century. But beyond opening him up to individuals from the other side of the continent, it is hard to identify how Menesios or Gordon played a formative part in Peter's education. Perhaps more consequential was the role played by the statesman and minister Artemon Matveev, the foreign minister of Russia for much of the 1670s, and a figure who favored the adoption of progressive social, political, and scientific ideas coming from Western and Central Europe. Peter's own mother may have been important in influencing him in this direction as well, and Matveev's promotion in the 1670s was owing, to some extent, to the patronage of Natalia. Peter was born during a period of contrasting fortunes for Russia. The Russian state had emerged in the late 15th and early 16th centuries out of the Duchy of Muscovy, a comparatively small state by comparison with modern Russia, centered on the city of Moscow and lands along the middle course of the river Volga. Under a number of capable rulers like Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, Muscovy had expanded to conquer lands further down the river Volga, eventually reaching the Caspian Sea. Then, Russian military explorers began trekking over the Ural Mountains, beginning the process whereby the Russian state would expand thousands of kilometers eastwards all the way to the Pacific Ocean. There were also growing efforts to expand westwards into what are now Belarus and Ukraine. Yet, the other side of this period of immense expansion was chaotic internal politics, with a dysfunctional government epitomized in the Time of Troubles, a period between 1598 and 1613, when Russia went through 6 rulers in 15 years and experienced wars and famines which killed an estimated 1 million people. The situation had begun to stabilize somewhat thereafter, but by comparison with other large European states further to the west, like England, France, Spain, Austria, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic, Russia was socially, economically, and politically backwards, with little trade or industry. It was a society that was mired in the medieval past. This duality between a powerful nation of great potential, though one which was unable to fully manifest that potential, found further expression in the geopolitical conflicts of the time, ones which would dominate Peter's subsequent time as ruler of Russia. As geographically huge a nation as it was starting to become by the end of the 16th century, Russia had a major geographical problem. It had acquired access to the Caspian Sea to the south and the White Sea to the north, but the Caspian Sea is a lake, and the White Sea breezes over for nearly half of the year, making the main port there, Arkhangельsk, of limited use for trade with Europe. Thus, what Russia needed were warm water ports, either in the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea. The quest to acquire an entry point to the Baltic Sea, which was dominated by the Kingdom of Sweden, a power that controlled Finland and Livonia in the Baltic States region for centuries, was a major factor in the beginning of a series of conflicts in the 1550s that would run for roughly 170 years. Known as the Northern Wars, these largely involved Russia, Sweden, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to determine which of these 3 great powers would dominate the Baltic Sea and Eastern Europe. The Danish and other powers like Brandenburg Prussia were periodically pulled into them. A sign of Russia's internal weaknesses in the late 16th century and into the 17th was that, despite having a population some 6 times that of Sweden, Sweden had emerged in the mid-17th century as the preeminent power in the Baltic Sea. Peter's reign would see the tide turn definitively. Peter's earliest years were tumultuous ones in terms of his family life and place in the succession. In the first weeks of 1676, when Peter was just 3.5 years old, his father died, almost certainly of a heart attack, though this may have been brought on by renal disease, suggesting, given Peter's own health in later life, that kidney issues were hereditary in the family. With his passing at just 46 years of age, he was succeeded by his eldest surviving son, Fyodor, who now became Tsar Fyodor III at the young age of 14. His health was never good, and he died at just 20 years old in 1682. Despite marrying twice in his short life, neither of these unions had produced an heir, his first wife dying owing to complications of childbirth, along with the infant. Thus, with young Fyodor's passing, there were just two potential successors, Peter and his half-brother Ivan. Neither were adults. Ivan was 15, and Peter was just about to turn 10 years old. Ivan should have succeeded in his own right if the rule of primogeniture were being applied, but a dispute quickly arose when two different factions at the Romanov court in Moscow, between the supporters of Ivan's maternal family, the Miloslavskaya family, and the supporters of Peter's mother and her family, the Naryshkina. Eventually, a compromise was reached, whereby both Peter and Ivan jointly ascended as co-Tsars, Ivan V and Peter I, with Peter's half-sister Sophia, who was into her mid-20s by 1682, ruling as regent during her brother and half-brother's minorities. Prince Vasily Golitsyn, a powerful Russian aristocrat, emerged as an influential figure within the new government set up as well. For a time in the mid-1680s, the arrangement worked somewhat agreeably for all parties. Ivan and Peter were still young and not of a mind to exercise power to too great an extent. Peter began to spend more and more time in the company of the expat community in the German Quarter and other parts of Moscow, displaying an ever greater interest in the European ideas that he had begun to imbibe during his youth. He also married for the first time. This was to Eudoxia Lopakina, the daughter of a leading Russian nobleman and official. The union came in 1689, when she was 19 and Peter was 16. They would have 3 children, Alexei, born in 1690, followed by Alexander and Paul in 1692 and 1693. Both Alexander and Paul died in infancy, though Alexei would live into his late 20s. The marriage would only last a few more years after the deaths of the 2 infants, as Peter had become opposed to the religious and social conservatism of his wife and forced her relatives to have her join a monastic order so that he could marry his long-term mistress, Anna Montz, the daughter of a German merchant who he had met in the early 1690s in the German Quarter. It was soon made apparent to Peter that such a marriage would not be acceptable to the Russian aristocracy. Hence, Peter would not marry again until 1707. In the interim, he took several other mistresses and sired several illegitimate children. The man who emerged in the 1690s was a figure with a forceful personality. Peter knew what he wanted and had an energy about him which made him one of the most outstanding political and social reformers in the history of early modern Europe. There were contradictions too. He was at heart a liberal, at least by the standards of the time when liberalism meant a drive towards secularism and rationalism without the egalitarian overtones that we associate with it today. At the same time, he was a bullish autocrat. Peter also cut an imposing figure. A fierce disposition, mid-length brownish-black hair and moustache were atop a large frame, with Peter standing 6'8" tall, an enormous height by the standards of the late 17th century, when the average height of men was just 5.5 feet, several inches less than it is today. One notable feature of his appearance was that he suffered from a neck spasm and facial tics. He liked the finer things that Western European culture had to offer, yet at the same time, he was not a figure who avoided hardship, campaigning extensively with his armies and, as we will see, being willing to live in very humble surroundings for the purposes of achieving a higher goal. One of the most curious elements of Peter's early life and reign was the establishment of a group he founded known as the all-joking, all-drunken Synod of Fools and Jesters. The 17th and 18th centuries saw private clubs and societies proliferate around Europe, with groups such as the Rosicrucians and Freemasons emerging at this time, and others, such as the Royal Society. Many of these were progressive groups that aimed to promote societal change, but others, such as the Hellfire Club founded in London in the early 18th century, were more like modern university fraternities with an emphasis on heavy drinking and carousing. The all-joking, all-drunken Synod of Fools and Jesters, which Peter and his friends in Moscow established in the early 1690s, first as the Jolly Company, and then later as the Synod, fell into the latter category. Peter and dozens of his associates would meet for drunken gatherings in Moscow, where they would elect members as the Prince Caesar or Pope, the titles used often mocking organized religion and other paragons of traditional society. The Synod of Fools and Jesters pointed towards Peter's disdain for the conservative elements of Russian society, as well as a frivolity of his late teens and early 20s that was soon abandoned. Already by the late 1680s, the co-rulership of Peter and Ivan was showing strains as both men became adults, and Peter began expressing his impulse to rule in his own right. There were also those at court who had held considerable power since 1682 who wanted to continue to exercise it. One such individual was Peter's sister Sophia and her close ally, Prince Golitsyn, who was possibly her lover as well. Peter's efforts to assert his own power in 1689 led Sophia and Golitsyn to enter into a quasi-rebellion. A sign of Peter's growing dominance of the court above both his half-sister and half-brother was seen when he forced Sophia into being confined to a convent and exiled Golitsyn to the White Sea region, sparing his life only through the intercession of several powerful Russian aristocrats. Peter's ascent as the preeminent power in Russia was confirmed when on the 8th of February 1696, his co-ruler, Tsar Ivan V, died at 29 years of age. Yet, in reality, Peter had been the ruler of Russia for many years, Ivan having suffered from several terrible illnesses for years that left him blind, senile, and largely paralyzed long before his death came. Hence it was the case that an increasingly autocratic and powerful Tsar Peter I ruled over Russia from the early spring of 1696 onwards. As Ivan's health collapsed at near death in the mid-1690s, Peter had been away from Moscow, serving a major military apprenticeship. Since the Ottoman Turks had nearly captured the city of Vienna in 1683, a coalition of Christian European powers had been waging war on the Turks in something of an unofficial latter-day crusade. With the Ottomans weakened by attacks in the Balkans and the Mediterranean, Russia had been active in the region north of the Black Sea against the Turks since 1686. In 1695, nearly a decade into the long Russo-Turkish War, Peter led a major military expedition south to the Azov region around what is now the Rostov Oblast in southwestern Russia, near eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. Here, he commanded a huge coalition of probably over 100,000 Russian soldiers and their Cossack allies from Zaporizhia and other adjoining areas against the Turks and their own allies amongst the Crimean Tatars. Bitter fighting followed for control of Azov and several other fortresses in the region. The Russians would eventually emerge victorious, acquiring control over several key locations on the River Don that were important stepping stones on the road to becoming a major power on the Black Sea. This was also part of the first major war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, a rivalry in this region that would continue between the two powers until the First World War, nearly 2.5 centuries later. Peter's accession to become the sole Tsar of Russia commenced in a most unusual manner. Russia and Muscovy before it had long had relations with some of the European powers. The English, for instance, had sent expeditions to the White Sea in the 1550s and established trade ties with Russia through the Muscovy Company. But in many ways, Russia was still isolated from much of Europe, and in particular the massive advances in science, philosophy, politics, medicine, and industry, which were taking place in countries like England, France, Germany, and the Netherlands in the 16th and 17th centuries, had failed to permeate into Russian society. Hence, in the early spring of 1697, Peter began preparing to set off with a large embassy of diplomats and courtiers for Western Europe. Over the next year and a half, the Great Embassy of Peter the Great, as it has become known, traversed through Europe, heading first to the Baltic States region and Prussia, then across Germany to the Dutch Republic, before voyaging across the English Channel to Britain. He spent the first months of 1698 there, before returning again to the continent, and spending the summer traveling to southern Germany, Austria, and across the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before reaching Russia again in the autumn of 1698. The objective of the Great Embassy was to see firsthand the many innovations in science and technology that were underway in Western and Central Europe, while also fostering better diplomatic ties with some of the great powers of the continent. For instance, while in Amsterdam, Peter learned about Dutch shipbuilding methods from a nation that had carved out a virtual monopoly on the carrying trade of goods from the Baltic Sea to Western Europe, while also meeting with Jacob de Wilde, a naval administrator and antiquarian. While in the Dutch capital, Antony von Leeuwenhoek, a businessman who had an interest in developing microscopes and lenses decades earlier, and is often termed the father of microbiology on account of his innovations in this field, also met several times with the Russian leader and demonstrated the use of his microscopes. In England, he visited a wide range of locations where scientific innovations and Western developments could be observed, notably the banking and coinage system at the Royal Mint, developments in the natural sciences and humanities at the University of Oxford, and a wide range of scientific pursuits at the Royal Society. Throughout, he showed great curiosity, particularly for skills of a practical nature, which could be of use back in Russia, whether in developing a Russian navy, making its government more efficient, or improving economic activity through the practical application of scientific methods, a process which was underway already in Britain, and which has since come to be known as the improving movement, a necessary precursor to the Industrial Revolution of the second half of the 18th century. Having returned to Russia in the autumn of 1698, Peter quickly began trying to put the new skills he had observed and acquired to use within his government and country, introducing a raft of reforms in the late 1690s, and in particular in the 1700s, based on what he had seen and experienced in Amsterdam, London, and other parts of Western and Central Europe. For instance, newspapers were first introduced into Russia on Peter's orders. The St. Petersburgsky Vedomosti, or St. Petersburg Record, began publication on the 2nd of January 1703 and is generally credited with being Russia's first newspaper. It is still being published today over 3 centuries later. In terms of religion, Peter was determined that the Orthodox Church, which for centuries had been a virtual political entity within the Russian state, ruled by the Patriarch of the Church, was brought more firmly under state control, with a synod appointed to manage it, one over which the Tsars could thenceforth exercise greater control. The number of bureaucrats and administrators markedly increased in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the 1700s and 1710s, at a time when all early modern governments realized that having more and more well-trained officials was the key to increasing the tax base, and with it, the power of the state. Peter could, though, be eccentric in some of his reforms as well. He introduced the Julian calendar, the calendar devised in Roman times and named after Julius Caesar, as the new calendar of Russia in the early 1700s, despite the fact that most of Western and Central Europe had transitioned by the beginning of the 18th century to the Gregorian calendar, which was more scientifically accurate. The greatest of Peter's political reforms was the creation of the governing Senate of Russia. Years in the planning, it was formally established in 1711 and replaced the traditional Boyar Duma, a kind of aristocratic council of Russian lords that had functioned intermittently in Russia for centuries, often producing dysfunctional politics that led to the Time of Troubles a century earlier. The Senate was instead established as a more meritocratic form of governing council. It would consist of 9 senators who were picked from amongst the generals, advisors, and officials at the Russian court, men with years of experience and success in their respective fields, rather than figures of dubious credentials other than simply being aristocrats. The Senate would carry out many major administrative duties in the 1710s and early 1720s, while Peter traveled around Russia and abroad in Europe. Still, while the creation of this and his many other reforms would point towards Peter being an enlightened ruler, there was always the other side of Russian politics, the side Peter failed to even consider reforming. A secret police had existed in Russia in the form of the oprichnik since the days of Ivan the Terrible in the middle of the 16th century, and Peter very much continued the tradition, with Prince Fyodor Yurievich Romodanovsky acting as the head of his intelligence services and gaining a fearsome reputation as the man who crushed opposition to Peter where it arose amongst the political classes in Moscow and St. Petersburg during the reign. Peter also failed to make any move towards a representative parliament in Russia. During the Great Embassy to Western Europe in 1697 and 1698, Peter had tried to build up an alliance with the Dutch, English, and others against the Ottoman Empire, intending to go to war with the Turks to expand Russian influence in the Caucasus and in the region north of the Black Sea. But within a few years, his military focus would be pulled elsewhere. While he was engaged in his travels, King Charles XI of Sweden had died prematurely at 41 years of age from abdominal cancer. He was succeeded by his 16-year-old son. Because of the youth of the new king and the perception that Sweden had declined as a power in the second half of the 17th century, after the glory days of the 1630s and 1640s, when Swedish armies had intervened in the 30 Years' War and even captured the city of Prague in their war with the House of Habsburg, the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway decided to go to war with the Swedes in 1700, hoping to prize lands off them along the southern shores of the Baltic Sea. Peter soon allied with the Danes, as did the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was the beginning of the Great Northern War, a conflict that would last 21 years, and which, despite being ostensibly started by the Danes, would focus after a time on a clash between Russia and Sweden, the dominance of the Baltic Sea. Peter's primary goal in entering into it was to acquire a Baltic port, as the region of Russia around the Gulf of Finland, where St. Petersburg stands today, was Swedish territory in the 17th century. The Great Northern War went through several phases, and the fighting was more intense at some times than others. In the first years of it, the Swedes managed to repel many of the attacks along the southern shores of the Baltic Sea by the Danes and others, but Peter succeeded in conquering the eastern side of the Gulf of Finland, giving him access to the Baltic Sea. There was much over and back in the years that followed, culminating in the Battle of Poltava in what is now central Ukraine on the 8th of July 1709. A Swedish army of upwards of 30,000 men had penetrated well into Polish and Russian territory. It was met here by a much larger Russian army led by Peter. Although the Russians and their Cossack allies from the Volga and Ukrainian region outnumbered the Swedes by more than 2 to 1, the Swedish army was one of the most technically advanced in 17th century Europe, and the result was more than a foregone conclusion based on numbers alone. Peter emerged victorious from it, inflicting 10,000 casualties on the Swedes in terms of men killed, wounded, or captured. Poltava was the decisive conflict of the Great Northern War. In the aftermath of it, King Charles XII of Sweden ended up in exile in the Ottoman Empire, and Sweden's enemies invaded its territories from all sides, hoping to get as much of the collapsing power's land as possible. As we will see, some developments in the mid-1710s would briefly turn the tide again, and so the war would drag on until the early 1720s. The initial successes for Russia and the first 10 years of the Great Northern War finally gave Peter access to the Baltic Sea. As soon as the bridgehead on the eastern shore of the Gulf of Finland was secured, and with the war very much still in full swing, he began building what he envisaged would become a great new city and capital on the Baltic coast. St. Petersburg was named after St. Peter, not the Tsar himself, and the site was consecrated on the 29th of June 1703, the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. The name simply means the town of St. Peter. One of the core early buildings erected by the Tsar was the Peter and Paul fortress in acknowledgement that the new city was, at least for the time being, a front in the war with Sweden. Over the next 20 years, a mass of Russian peasant labor and Swedish prisoners of war were employed to begin building the fortress outwards into a town and then a city. Many Swiss, Dutch, and Italian architects, engineers, and designers were brought to Russia by Peter to design elements of the new planned city and oversee its construction. By the time he moved the official capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg in 1712, work was advanced to begin building a cathedral, palaces, a naval yard, and many other features that would ensure that the city would be a capital fitting of the new Russia and its place on the world stage. We get a telling insight into Peter's character and the manner in which he ruled from the residence he lived in while St. Petersburg was under construction from 1703 into the 1710s. One of the first edifices he had built near the river Neva that the new capital was erected on was a very modest log cabin. This was constructed in the tradition of an izba, a kind of medieval Russian cottage that a prosperous farmer or tradesman might live in. He would live here on and off whenever he was in St. Petersburg, overseeing the construction work for much of the next decade. Later, the building was preserved as a historical memento and, despite its relatively brittle state, is still intact today. It reveals that Peter spent a significant portion of his 30s living in a very modest wooden house, one which was way below the standards a Tsar of all Russia might typically expect. It speaks volumes. Peter was more interested in being present at St. Petersburg to oversee his great building project and living a Spartan life if necessary to do so, than to spend his time indolently lounging around his palaces in Moscow. A major goal of gaining access to the Baltic Sea and commencing the building of a great new capital on the Gulf of Finland was to make Russia into a naval power. To this end, in 1701, Peter had already established the Moscow School of Mathematics and Navigation. Housed in the Sukharev Tower, an iconic building that Peter had ordered the construction of in the old capital back in the mid-1690s, the school was opened with the express purpose of furthering the study of the sciences and their practical application in Moscow. It was intended that Russian officers would receive their basic naval training here before being sent to serve their apprenticeship on the Navy that was to be created in due course. Peter himself led the charge, advancing through the ranks of Russia's burgeoning navy in the 1700s and 1710s, as though he were a mere officer progressing normally through these stations. By 1709, he was a commander of a ship, then a vice admiral 5 years later, until he was promoted to a full admiral in 1721. The school in Moscow more broadly became a training establishment for artillery officers and engineers, as well as a means by which Peter sought to fashion the Russian military into one which would use modern tactics and weapons, rather than sheer numbers to defeat its enemies. Throughout these years, Peter continued to try to draw some of Europe's finest minds to Russia, to advise him and to help train a new cadre of officials to drag Russia into the 18th century as it was experienced in England, the Netherlands, France, and Germany. This was facilitated through the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences and Arts, an institution which was only formally opened in February 1724, but which had been in gestation for well over a decade at that point. Peter received considerable advice on this project from one of the great minds of the time. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz is not as much of a household name as he should be today, in large part because he was eclipsed by his contemporary, Isaac Newton. But Leibniz independently reached many of the same conclusions as Newton did in the fields of physics, mathematics, and optics in the 1670s and 1680s. He and Peter had first met in October 1711. However, by then, there had been over a decade of proposals and correspondence concerning an Academy of Science to be established in the new Russian capital based on the Tsar's patronage and Leibniz's ideas. They continued to discuss the matter frequently in the years that followed, though ultimately Leibniz was long dead before the project took shape, passing away in 1716. There were many other ambitious reforms during these years initiated by Peter. One of the most important was the foundation in 1717 of the Collegium, a system of governmental departments not unlike our modern civil service and government functions. There was already a system of this kind in Russia, yet it resembled the system of a privy council or small cohort of ministers around a monarch that had developed in places like England as early as the 12th century. The Collegium was a new system which reflected more the growing powers of a centralized bureaucratic state, with colleges overseeing things like foreign affairs, expenditure, justice, fiscal reform, military affairs, industry and mining, and the navy and admiralty. To ensure the smooth operations of the new system, Peter yet again initiated a building program, ordering the erection of a red brick Collegium building in central St. Petersburg. It still stands there today, despite the horrors and destruction of the revolutions and wars of the 20th century, and is home to the St. Petersburg State University today. The Collegium oversaw some of the other reforms instituted by Peter. A particular interest of his was educational reform. While the Academy of Sciences and Arts in St. Petersburg was an elite institution for promising scholars, a wider system of what we would call secondary schools was also brought into being by Peter, who believed that the sons of the Russian aristocracy and burgeoning middle class should be well educated in order to be at the forefront of Russia's advance as a progressive nation. In tandem, the Tsar sought to restrict the power of the Russian Orthodox Church, an institution which he perceived as restricting progressive scientific movements in Russia, and also swallowing up into it some of the most promising young minds in the country. In all this, Peter was one of the first great examples of what has been termed an enlightened absolutist ruler, one of the monarchs of 18th century Europe that held absolutist monarchical power, yet who wielded it in a rather enlightened manner. Later examples would include Catherine the Great of Russia, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and, in his own way, Napoleon Bonaparte for a time early on in his reign in France. There were many more elements to it when it came to Peter, and everything from the monetary system and the use of decimalization to private industry and canal building were spheres of activity which he showed an interest in and made comprehensive advances in during the 1700s, 1710s, and early 1720s. In 1716 and 1717, Peter headed on what has often been termed his second embassy. Like the first 2 decades earlier, he ended up traveling across Central Europe to Western Europe, where he met with scientists and figures who were at the forefront of technological innovation and study. The second embassy, though, seems to have been more of an impromptu affair, with Peter being drawn to Central Europe over various diplomatic engagements and then deciding to travel onwards to the west. What marked this second embassy as substantially different to the first was that his end destination was France rather than England. In Paris and Versailles, he was entertained at the court of King Louis XV, though not by the king himself, who was just 7 years old, having succeeded to the throne as a 5-year-old, and also visited the Sorbonne and many other institutions in the capital. There was more of a sense of prestige tour as well on this second venture, with Peter buying up artworks and other cultural items to take back to Russia to decorate his new palaces in St. Petersburg, while also carrying out diplomatic negotiations like a Russian ruler determined to indicate to the Dutch, French, and others that Russia had arrived on the European stage. Still, he was always on the lookout for lessons to be learned in terms of science and technology, bringing back Dutch reclamation methods to Russia, which allowed for the creation of New Holland Island, or Admiralty Island, in central St. Petersburg in 1719. Part of the reasoning behind Peter's travel westwards in 1716 and 1717 had been to carry out diplomatic discussions with several of the European powers, as England, Prussia, and others had been drawn into the Great Northern War in various ways in the course of the 1710s. The conflict had also acquired a southern front when the Ottomans became involved in 1710, seeking to promote Swedish interests in order to offset Russian gains at a time when Russia was emerging as the primary foe of the Turks in the Black Sea region and the Caucasus. King Charles XII had headed home to Sweden in 1714 after years in exile in Constantinople, and had managed to revive the Swedish war effort by the time of his death in 1718 to a sufficient extent that Sweden was no longer facing the prospect of complete annihilation. Thus, in the late 1710s, peace negotiations were entered into by all sides. Most sides had come to terms with the Swedes in 1719 and 1720, with Stockholm ceding much of its territory and influence on the southern banks of the Baltic Sea to the Danes and Prussians in return for peace. It was not until September 1721 that the Treaty of Neustadt was finally agreed between Peter's Russia and King Frederick I of Sweden. Under the terms of it, the Swedes acknowledged Russia in its possession of the lands on the eastern side of the Gulf of Finland, where Peter had built St. Petersburg, while also ceding Estonia and Livonia, the latter a region approximating with much of modern-day Latvia to the Russians. The treaty was notable in the long run in largely establishing the southern border between Russia and Finland as it stands today, with only some minor changes occurring over time. Overall, the Treaty of Neustadt represented a major victory for Peter and Russia in the Great Northern War. With the end of the Great Northern War, Peter determined that a change of his official title was appropriate to declare to both the Russian people and the rest of Europe that a new great power was emerging from its slumber between Poland and the Baltic in the west and the Ural Mountains in the east. In November 1721, he adopted the title of Emperor of Russia and declared the creation of a Russian empire. He and his successors would continue to be known by the honorific title of Tsar, but henceforth this was an imperial title rather than that of a king. He also established a pattern in doing so, and over the next century and a half, Austria, Germany, and France would also acquire emperors and become known as empires at various times. The years that followed would reflect these growing imperial ambitions. Through various events since the mid-1680s, Russian influence in what is now Ukraine had been growing at the expense of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottomans, and the powerful local Crimean Tatars and Kievan Cossacks. This would continue into the 1720s, with Russia exerting greater influence of Kiev along the course of the Dnieper River, while also displaying more power in what is now Belarus, at a time when the degree to which the Polish-Lithuanian rulers exerted centralized control over regions on their eastern borders was very limited. More broadly, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was entering into a period of terminal decline after the Great Northern War, and Peter's successors would swallow up vast portions of its territory in Ukraine, Belarus, and eastern Poland over the next 70 years. By the early 1720s, the question of the succession had become a politically charged one in Russia. Peter had eventually married for a second time, taking Marta Elena Skoronska, a woman who appears to have been the daughter of a modest Polish-Lithuanian farmer, as his wife in late 1707. It was clearly a romantic partnership based on mutual affection rather than a political marriage. Even so, it had the advantage of being to a woman who was not from Russia, and as a consequence, did not seem to favor one side or another at the notoriously faction-riven Russian court. By the time they married, Marta, who took the queen consort name of Catherine, had already had 3 children with Peter, 2 sons and a daughter, all of whom died in infancy. Marriage only slightly improved this natal history. She and Peter had 9 more children, but of these, only 2, Anna, born in 1708, and Elizabeth, born in 1709, would live to become adults. This meant that Peter had no living legitimate male heirs from either of his marriages, and while Russia was soon to embark on a remarkable period of female monarchy, it was still considered highly contentious in a militaristic society, like early modern Russia, for a woman to succeed to the throne. Nevertheless, he was determined that one of his daughters would succeed him, and made it clear to the court that female succession was allowable under Russian royal law. The declaration of the legitimacy of female succession opened up a dispute at the Russian court and plotting behind the scenes to potentially overthrow the government if Peter died, and either his wife or one of his 2 surviving daughters was proposed as Tsarina. In response, Peter issued a document which would have a bearing on Russian society for the next 2 centuries. This is known as the Table of Ranks, a document issued in 1722, which sought to reform the old system of seniority and privilege in Russian society, being based exclusively on how ancient the aristocratic family from which they came was. Instead, Ita declared the inception of a new system based on merit, whereby individuals who had served the Russian state in some special capacity would be recognized above older lines of less active aristocrats. The table consisted of 14 different ranks and laid out clear criteria for how a person entered into each one. It was an innovative system and one that was highly peculiar for such a conservative society in early modern times, outlining exactly how one moved from one rank to the other in different spheres like the government, navy, army, and church, much as a person would be told the criteria for promotion within an organization or company in more modern times. The Table of Ranks would influence Russian society down to the Russian Revolution in 1917. A clear indication of the expanding ambitions of Russia by the 1720s was Peter's decision almost as soon as the Great Northern War was over to launch an expedition against the Persian Safavid Empire. The Persians ruled virtually the only state in the Middle East that had not succumbed to Ottoman rule in the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. Their territory extended across modern-day Iran, as well as parts of what are now Iraq, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Central Asia into places like Turkmenistan. In 1722, Peter launched an invasion of their territory by both land and sea in the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea, to some degree with the aim of acquiring Persian territory in the Caucasus before the Ottomans did so. The Persians clearly being a declining power by this time. The Tsar led the expedition himself, heading south to Astrakhan on the Caspian coast, and then leading his forces to capture several towns in the region in modern-day Azerbaijan. It was a resounding military success, a war which demonstrated the growing superiority of European militaries over those of Asiatic powers, at a time when Britain and other countries were about to begin conquering large parts of the continent elsewhere. The Treaty of St. Petersburg, agreed in 1723, saw Persia cede large parts of the Caucasus region to Russia. It was the first of many wars the Russians would fight in Central Asia over the next century, at the expense of local powers like the Persians. Back in Russia itself, these years saw some of Peter's grand building projects begin to come to fruition. Foremost amongst these was the Peterhof Palace, a vast palatial complex which Peter had ordered the construction of at St. Petersburg in 1717, after being inspired by his visit to the Palace of Versailles outside Paris during his second embassy to Western Europe. Domenico Trezzini, a Swiss-Italian architect who had been employed by Peter since 1703, after being recruited from Denmark, was responsible for designing and overseeing the construction of it, in an architectural form which has since come to be identified as Petrine Baroque, a form of Baroque architecture which is so synonymous with St. Petersburg that it is named after the city and the Tsar who patronized the construction of the city. The Peterhof was spread out over nearly 400 hectares and included sprawling gardens, the Montplaisir Palace, the Peterhof Palace itself, and a series of grand staircases and fountains in emulation of Versailles. The first phase of building at what was termed the Russian Versailles was completed by the mid-1720s, though work would continue for several more years until 1728, and other rulers later in the 18th century continued to add to the complex. It was far from the only major building of its kind conceived by Peter. While the Peterhof was built on largely undeveloped lands to the west of St. Petersburg itself, the Tsar ordered the construction of the first winter palace in the center of the city as early as 1711, though the modern-day winter palace is more the result of the Tsar's successor's work than Peter's achievement. Peter would never live to see much of the building work at St. Petersburg completed. Around the time he returned to Russia from the expedition to Persia, his health began to decline. For years he had evidently been suffering from poorly functioning kidneys, and over time this had begun to create a subset of problems, most notably uremia, where the body retains urea owing to an inability of the kidneys to process it properly. This in turn led to a buildup of nitrogen and other compounds in his system. While European medical knowledge was still primitive by comparison with modern methods in the 18th century, the medical revolution was well enough advanced by the 1720s that Peter was able to bring skilled physicians to St. Petersburg to try to treat his condition. Surgery resulted in the release of several liters of retained liquid. It did not, though, solve the underlying conditions and may have caused an infection. His health declined precipitously thereafter, and by January 1725, he was in his sickbed. There he died on the 8th of February, his bladder being gangrenous at the time. Despite the enormous changes he had brought to Russia and the length of his reign, he was just 52 years of age, and his death was somewhat premature. The succession had been left open to question. His funeral was held in the new capital, and his remains were interred in the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul that he ordered the construction of in St. Petersburg back in the early 1710s. This began a tradition whereby every Tsar of Russia henceforth would be interred in the imperial tombs of the cathedral. While in reality Peter left open both the question of his succession and various other matters relating to Russia, within decades, rumors arose of an alleged will that Peter had produced in his final illness. The cause of this seems to have been a misinterpretation in some other European countries of statements by Russian statesmen and Tsarinas from the 1740s that they were following the policies of Peter the Great. This was intended to simply demonstrate that they were following traditions of Russian expansion that had been laid down by Peter. But in the 1790s, a period of paranoid conspiracy theory creation across Europe, from whence many of the modern notions about the Freemasons and the Illuminati plotting to dominate Europe emerged, Another theory came into being that Peter had actually written down a last will and testament in which he had advised his successors to foster Russia into a power that would conquer all of Europe. Over time, forgeries of this alleged document even appeared, and in the 19th century it even guided many British statesmen and their attitudes towards Russia. There is no evidence to suggest any such will was ever produced by Peter, and it remains hearsay. Following Peter's death, his second wife rose to the throne as Tsarina Catherine I. This began a remarkable period of over 70 years, where the Russian state was broadly headed by female monarchs. Of the 7 Tsars and Tsarinas that reigned between 1725 and 1796, all were women, and they held the throne for a combined 68 years out of the 72 years involved, a period of sustained female monarchy that has few parallels anywhere in the world, with 19th century Madagascar, England during the second half of the 16th century, and parts of Southeast Asia in late medieval and early modern times being some of the few comparable cases. From amongst these Tsarinas, Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, was surely the most impressive, expanding Russia southwards to become a power in the Black Sea in the manner which Peter had made it a Baltic Sea power. She also combines the same blend of enlightened rule and autocratic power-mongering that Peter did, engaging in a liberal reform program while trampling over the rights of the Polish people by engaging in the partitions of Poland along with Prussia and Austria. A sign of just how much she and Peter the Great transformed Russia in the 18th century was seen in the role Russia played in defeating Napoleon Bonaparte and the French in the 1800s and 1810s. The foundations for Russia's emergence as a global superpower were laid in the 18th century by these two rulers. Unsurprisingly, given Peter's enormous importance for the history of the Russian state, he has become a central figure in the country's historiography and politics. The very designation of him as the Great suggests as much. And this was not just in the days of the Russian Empire and the 18th and 19th centuries. Even the Bolsheviks had to engage with the legacy of Peter after the Communists came to power and established the Soviet Union from 1917 onwards, aware that their own empire was indebted to the processes undertaken by Peter. Still, they were conflicted in this, with Joseph Stalin once declaring that Peter was Peter, a rejection of the designation of him as the Great. Things have come full circle in recent decades, though. A 2005 poll in Russia saw Peter voted #1 as the greatest leader of Russia ever. More importantly, for all that he has been described as attempting to initiate a latter-day version of the Cold War, Vladimir Putin primarily idolizes and models himself after Peter the Great, not Joseph Stalin. Moreover, his political approach, seeking to reassert Russian rule over parts of Eastern Europe which were lost at the end of the Cold War, harks back to the 18th century, when Peter the Great and Catherine the Great expanded the Russian state into these regions. Peter has cast a long shadow over modern Russia. Peter the Great was a ruler of contrast. On the one hand, his reign witnessed the birth of modern Russia. It was he, more than any other individual, who reformed Russian society and began trying to turn it into a European state, rather than just a country on the periphery of Europe. He engaged in all manner of political, social, and economic reforms, ones which saw the beginning of the transition to modernity in a country that was otherwise profoundly backwards by comparison with England, France, or the Dutch Republic when he came to the throne in the late 17th century. In defeating Sweden and the Great Northern War and gaining access to the Baltic Sea, he also furthered Russia's emergence as one of the great powers of the continent. Yet, on the other hand, he was a typical Russian ruler in many ways, presiding over an autocratic state in which secret police and local power brokers were used to centralize power in the hands of one man and a close cadre of individuals around him. In this regard, his rule served to entrench autocracy as the guiding principle of Russian politics, in ways which still resonate 3 centuries after his own time. If rulers earn the moniker of the Great because of the manner in which they transformed a country and shaped its history long after their own time, then Peter certainly deserves to be known as Peter the Great. But that does not mean his rule was without flaws or negative lasting consequences. What do you think of Peter the Great? Was he the greatest of the Tsars of Russia? Or is it ultimately too difficult to reconcile the progressive reforms he implemented with the autocracy which he continued to foster in Russia's political culture in ways which still resonate 3 centuries after his own time? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.